Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Anglo Election Insights. And today, with the full distribution of preferences occurring across the seats and the final results of the Senate being revealed today, I believe, I thought I would go through and give an update on this potential pendulum, which is a project that I first started leading up to the 2025 election, and it's something that I wish to continue looking at through the 2028 election cycle, and we'll be creating ones for Victoria and New South Wales at the state level as well. But for now, I'm working with the margins that I've kind of worked out based on the late count. So just bear that in mind, that there will be like official two-party preferred margins, which might differ slightly from what I've got here. And if you do see some obvious errors or anything like that, just let me know in the comments and I'll get that fixed up for next time. So I'll just explain what I've done. I'm looking today at Labor with their predicted 94 seats. I'm not including Corwell in this, but I'm assuming it falls in their pile somewhere. And so there it is, 94 seats, and I've got them all the way down to 40, basically ranking them by which seats I think they're kind of least likely to hold, all the way down to which ones they are most likely to hold at the bottom. For you guys who've followed the channel for a little bit longer will understand how this works. Now, what I've done here is I've calculated the swing from 2025. So if it's a blue box, that's a swing to the Liberals. If it's a dark green box, that's to the Nats. Light green is to the Greens, and of course red is a swing to Labor. But I've also had a go at working out where I think the seat has trended, and to do that I've basically just found a mean between the state and the national swing. So for example, if a Labor seat is in Victoria, so for example Deakin, now it swung 2.7% to Labor, but here what I'm saying is that there was a 0.4% swing to Labor in Victoria and a 2.3% swing nationally. So the overall trend in Victoria is 1.55% to Labor, and we can see in Deakin that the 2.7% swing exceeds that trend by 1.15%. So that's the trend to Labor, whereas next door in McEwen the swing was only 0.8% based on my current figures. So that is actually a trend towards the Liberal Party. Slight trend. So hopefully that makes sense. And then in this column, of course, we've got the actual margin, which might change in the coming days. So please just bear that in mind. Okay, so I thought I'd start with the top. I've only gone to 100, but if we do get to a situation where the coalition are completely uncompetitive coming into 2028, or for some reason there's some sort of early election and they don't look like they're in a good electoral position at all, then we can consider the possibility of seats like Mitchell or Latrobe being, or maybe even McPherson or Fairfax being competitive. But for now, I'm just going to leave it as a handful up the top of the Liberals' most marginal held seats. We can see they're starting with Longman, which almost fell to Labor this time. So Labor's most marginal seat against the Liberals is Bullwinkle. You can see that that's had a swing to the Liberals and a trend to the Liberals, and I expect that would probably continue as the divide between sort of regional / rural and metropolitan Australia becomes even more polarized, particularly in WA with the live sheep export ban. So that could certainly be one that Labor wouldn't be confident of holding. Next, we've got a couple of these suburban seats which Labor are probably going to have a hard time holding on to. Petrie was one. They only hold it by just over 1%, but then other seats like Ford, Banks, Hughes, Moore, some of these seats that they only narrowly flip this time, and that seats that they wouldn't typically hold, and that the coalition do have a history of holding in opposition. These are kinds of seats that I think are more sort of landslide only seats, But again, if Labor does manage to consolidate its position within sort of middle suburban Australia, then they'll absolutely be competitive. But in a situation where Labor is potentially losing seats going into 2028, those would be the ones that I would expect to go. I've also got Bean and Fremantle up here, so it's really hard to tell with independents whether they're going to run again, whether the electoral preconditions for their success are going to be there. But I think Jessie Price and Kate Hewlett in particular have quite a lot of momentum behind them. I think at least Jessie Price has indicated that she's likely to go again, and you can see that there were big swings against Labor here, and they sit on pretty small margins there. So definitely a good chance that Labor could find themselves under threat. And just, I know that Climate 200 are not going to be able to back their candidates with the same sort of massive lump sums in specific seats because of the electoral laws that come into effect for this cycle, but they might find that their electoral success and influence will actually be much greater if they start targeting some Labor-held seats rather than just going for Liberal-held seats, particularly the regional and country ones, which, you know, despite huge campaigns in seats like Cowper and Wannon, they didn't even achieve swings towards them, let alone manage to pick up any seats. So then I've got a couple of other seats in here of note. So Solomon obviously had a big swing and an even bigger trend to the Liberals. It's probably likely to be a pretty swingy seat. Even if the coalition are doing well next cycle, I would say that that's no guarantee that Solomon continues to trend towards the Liberals. We thought that this time Lingiari would be a seat that would trend Liberal, and that they would pick it up based on a national swing towards them. But of course, that didn't happen. There was a national swing away from them, and there was a big trend away from them in Lingiari. So I wouldn't necessarily put a seat like Solomon in a box like that and just expect it to go. Bendigo had a particularly big and localized campaign from the Nats, which took the margin all the way down to 1.5. It could very well end up just being a flash in the pan. The state Victorian government, which seemed to be sort of almost as much the target of the campaign as the federal Labor government, they could well be gone by that stage. And, you know, Bendigo might actually just revert back to being, you know, a sort of semi-safe Labor seat by then, even if there's a national swing against them. But, you know, it was a very sort of different dynamic with the Nats running, and perhaps if that particular candidate goes again, you'd probably back him to win. And then the Green seats. So I want to focus mostly on the Labor column, but I will just make a note that the Greens, I actually have Wills as their second most likely, or their most likely pickup coming into 2028, with Ryan being their most likely seat to retain. I get the sense that in this coming cycle, it really depends how the Greens play it. They may decide sort of to double down and continue to focus on some of the issues which probably cost them seats this election, their stance on housing, their stance on Palestine, things that were quite divisive and probably resulted in some of their voters maybe going across to Labor looking for a slightly more moderate position. There'll be a lot of discussion on what really happened in terms of the Greens, but for now, I think one place where their message certainly was heard was in the inner northwest of Melbourne. Wills definitely falls into that kind of area, and I think Labor would have a hard time hanging on to that seat in future cycles. And again, Melbourne. Now, Melbourne's a tricky one because it seemed a little bit personal. It seemed like maybe people were actually quite sick of Adam Bandt, in the same way that Dixon swung even more than some of the surrounding Brisbane suburbs. Like, yes, there was obviously a local and national trend against the LNP, and Dutton kind of was ground zero for that. And you could say the same thing for the Greens, that, yep, there was a trend in the inner cities away from the Greens, but Adam Bandt copped the absolute brunt of it. So for the moment, though, I just think that Melbourne's got a little bit too much of that kind of south of the Yarra area, which does seem to be trending away from the Greens more broadly, and we saw that in McNamara, we saw it at the Param by-election, and it might not just be specific to Band himself. So yes, there is a big history of the Greens holding Melbourne and doing very well in that part of the city, but for the moment, I think Wills is actually slightly more likely to flip Green than for Melbourne to go back. But, you know, if Labor do have a sort of a difficult term and they find themselves getting a little bit pinched on the right, and maybe the Greens take up a slightly more conciliatory approach to politics, and they actually are able to place a bit more pressure on Labor's left flank, then seats like Wills and Melbourne are going to be very tough for Labor to hold against them. But overall, I think what the Greens are going to find is that more and more of these inner city contests are going to become Green versus Labor races, and those are going to be much harder for them to win, whereas they're probably a better chance in seats like Richmond, Brisbane and the like, where it's going to be a Green versus Liberal contest or Green versus Nat contest. So I'll focus a little bit more on the Greens in a future video, but just flagging that pardon me, but just flagging that as, you know, a potential sort of area of interest in terms of the dynamic between Labor and the Greens. So then we have a slew of Victorian seats. We've got McEwen, which, you know, it's going to become a bit of a white whale for the Liberals. I think they've gone for it for several cycles in a row, but just can't seem to crack it. It did trend towards them this time, but it seems that, you know, without really making big inroads in those kind of outer suburban and like peri-urban areas that they'd hoped to, that they're not going to be able to win seats like McEwen, but, you know, that could certainly change in future cycles. Deakin and Aston, perhaps with better candidates, perhaps with the coalition performing better with Chinese Australian voters. On those margins, you would expect that they would have some success. But again, they're like, particularly in Aston, which this swing and trend is all calculated off 2022. Perhaps the personal vote of Alan Tudge actually meant something, even though he did go out sort of under a bit of a scandal. That could be another factor there that I wasn't fully considering. Then we have Blair, which went nowhere. You know, the swing was only 0.3%, so that's actually a healthy trend towards the Liberals. Shane Newman is coming up on his 7th or 8th term as well, and while Queensland Labor no longer have a quota problem because they've they won a whole bunch of seats with female MPs, but I think another factor with Blair is that there is a redistribution upcoming in Queensland, and the general thought, from what I understand, is that Blair is going to become harder for Labor to defend, and with their MP potentially retiring based on that, I can see a situation where you know, the Liberals actually do have a really good chance there. So that's one to watch, and that one could certainly move up or down depending on what happens with that. 2 seats nationally where the Liberals actually got a swing towards them, and their sort of inside scoop was actually correct, were Pearce and Whitlam. They actually tried really hard in Pearce. They I think Dutton made a few visits there. Michaela Cash was there a lot talking about Pearce, and that's a pretty healthy trend. It's a big margin still, but, you know, if that big sort of correction back away from Labor does finally occur in 2028, that would be one to watch. And then Whitlam, of course, it won't be an empty seat next time, but that swing and trend is certainly something to watch. But again, a pretty weak result based on, you know, some of the internals that they were talking about there, with them being in the hunt or having their nose in front. They're still looking at a 6.4% margin. And even if all of those seats fell, you know, Labor's still sitting pretty much on a majority, and you know, a lot of those seats would be quite challenging seats to win for either the Greens or the coalition. I've got Richmond here. You know, again, in Richmond, I think the Greens definitely could have won it had Labor not been sort of so popular this time round. And I think in future cycles, Labor is still going to have a lot of trouble holding it. Justine Elliott's been an MP since, I think, 2004. So whether or not she goes round again could be something to watch too. This margin of 5% is my best guess at what the margin is between Labor and the Greens at the three candidate preferred level. I might be able to get a more accurate figure after today. Patterson, I think Dutton really sunk the coalition's chances in sort of northern Central Coast and the Hunter region with his comments, and I don't think the nuclear policy really landed there, and Labor actually got a trend to them in this seat, which is quite surprising. But I suspect they'll continue to target this area and look to get that one back to at least marginal status. Same with Wirrawar, there was a weak swing to Labor, and in New South Wales more broadly, the swing was really on in metropolitan Sydney. So that's actually trending Liberal, but again, pretty big margin. Dunkley, I think issues around crime might have made that one a little bit more competitive. There was a lot of signage around for Nathan Conroy too, and he's now a two-time candidate for Dunkley. Maybe he considers running again and has a bit more success next time. Hawke, slight swing to the Liberals, which indicates a bit of a trend, but still a big margin, and it's always going to be a pretty big Labor campaign there with Sam Ray as a sort of potential, maybe not party leader, but sort of party heavyweight. Bonner I have quite a bit lower despite the margin, just because the level of infill and development and the sort of concentration of professionals working there. It didn't look to me when I looked at the demographic data in terms of the electoral roll that there was a huge amount of change in terms of the age groups, but it seems that the more significant change was in professions and the amount of Chinese Australians there. So that's one that the coalition are probably going to struggle to win while they're in opposition, but it could be a seat that they make very competitive if they form government again. And then here we're getting into some of the seats that perhaps I expected them to win, like Gilmore, but that seem to be kind of trending away from them. So you've got seats like Gilmore, Chisholm, Dixon, Leichhardt, Tangney, all seats that they were hoping would be very competitive, but they've swung quite hard away from them. Eden Monaro is an interesting one, which actually trended Liberal, but staring down the barrel of a 7.3% margin, and where the swings occurred in Eden Monaro was quite interesting. The rural booths sort of down south in the Monaro region were actually quite strong, which will interest the Nationals at the state level, but they would need to make major gains in Queanbeyan, which with their sort of anti-Canberra policies was always going to be a bit of a challenge. Braddon, massive swing to Labor. That could well come back. So if Labor's not able to tread that kind of fine line between environmentalism and maintaining the sort of the resource economy in terms of salmon fishing and forestry and all that, then there's no reason why Braddon couldn't just swing all the way back. So that's certainly one to keep an eye on. Sturt, I think, has just flown off the map for the Liberals, and with that margin and just the way the seat's going, I think they'd find it extremely difficult to win it back. Macquarie, interesting that it actually trended Liberal. I'm not really sure why. With Susan Templeman, if she is thinking about retirement, that actually could become a competitive seat, but not really the right demographics for the Liberals to overturn. 7.8%, I would have thought. Bass, similar to Braddon, but perhaps kind of a little bit more outer suburban in nature rather than rural. Corangamite, a trend to the Liberals here. Seems like it was a case of good efforts from the local candidate, but this sort of area is just trending Labor and has been for quite a long time. Franklin, I've got the Independent, who may or may not run again. Again, similar to Braddon, it all depends on how Labor's term in government goes, and if conservation remains an issue that Labor is quite weak on, then that would certainly bring Peter George back into the game if he decides to run again. Lingiari, if you get bigger turnout there and the Liberals are, or the CLP is ascendant in the NT, then that could be an issue. I think the federal election and the NT 2028 election will fall in the same year, so that could be an interesting one to watch. Brisbane, I've got versus the Greens. I think it'll be like the LNP will lead the primary vote, but it's a case of if the coalition are sort of doing reasonably well in the cities, particularly with higher earning like inner city people, then that could potentially tip the balance in favour of the Greens, where the coalition could end up on like 38-39%, and then you could have a situation similar to 2022 where the Greens and Labor are pretty much level pegging and whoever gets over the line wins the seat. Although if it is indeed the Greens who make the final count, I probably wouldn't rule out the Liberals, particularly if they run another sort of strong candidate. McMahon was a seat that actually trended Liberal and swung Liberal, and if Chris Bowen is still in charge of the energy portfolio and that becomes a bit of a flashpoint in 2028, that could be one to watch. Ballarat I've included. Again, it swung towards the Liberals. Catherine King, she's been the MP since like 2001, I think. So, if that becomes an empty seat and maybe the Nats run a candidate in the same way that they did in Bendigo, that could be one to watch. Gorton, similar to Hawke, but again, a bigger margin. That won't be an empty seat again. Fraser was really interesting. The Greens made the count and they achieved a big swing towards them. And again, I think just looking at Melbourne, where they used to do sort of quite well in the inner southeast, it seems that they're with the way that they've played politics in the last 3 years, it seems that they are appealing a little bit more to that inner northern, inner western kind of part of Melbourne rather than the more affluent sort of Tree Tory inner southeast. So Fraser is one that we might find that they put quite a lot of energy into, and seats like McNamara become a little bit less of a priority for them. And then as we go down, these kind of Hunter Central Coast seats that have pretty much just flown off the map because of, I think at the southern end of the Central Coast, it was that work from home staff and just the way that the Liberals have really failed to connect with families and professional working women, that sort of thing. Whereas in the Hunter, it was specifically probably the efforts of the local MP to really capitalise on Dutton's really sort of ill-advised comments about the Hunter region. And I just think the nuclear policy just had no cut through here. People weren't really buying it. And then Bennelong, this is going to be a traditional seat, but even with a candidate that, like, I saw after in some like coverage after the election that Labor actually felt that Scott Young was a strong candidate, but they basically just managed to tie his brand to Dutton's, and that turned out to be really toxic with the Chinese Australian community. So that's going to be a really challenging seat to win back, even over multiple cycles. Griffith, with the LNP vote dropping so much, I think the Greens are really going to be in the wilderness here. But perhaps without sort of the controversy that Max Chandler-Mather brings, they could become more competitive there. Cooper, pretty safe against Jed Kearney. And then these seats here, just massive margins. The only one that sort of strikes me as being potentially in play would be Lyons, which again, really strong Labor incumbent now, but if the swing is on in Tasmania, we saw pretty much anything is possible. So definitely one not to completely write off. I think also the seats of Franklin and particularly Clark are significantly under quota now, which would mean that Lyons boundaries would have to move a little bit north, which would bring more kind of rural booths in and get rid of some of the northern Hobart suburbs, which would make it a little bit more difficult for Labor to hold if the coalition improves in rural Tasmania, but the margin's huge, so it sort of remains to be seen. All right, I think that'll do for today. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Please, this is just, immediately post the election, trying to kind of make sense of it all. And this order is not going to last very long. Things are going to change. The political winds are going to change. Different issues are going to come up. There's no way to predict what's going to happen this term. So keep that in mind. But I'd love to hear your comments and thoughts on where you would have certain things ordered, and what your kind of predictions are in terms of how things might play out and how that would affect which seats Labor perhaps would find more or less difficult to hold into this cycle. In future videos, I'll have a look at the coalition, I'll have a look at the independents maybe, and certainly the Greens, but for now I thought it might just be interesting to look at how Labor's majority could potentially hold up. So thanks for watching, guys. Please like the video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to the channel if you're new. I will be continuing to produce content all the way through sort of this period between elections. I think there's heaps to talk about, there's heaps to look at, so if you're keen for that and you enjoy that sort of topics, then please subscribe to the channel, and as always, comment your thoughts below. Thanks, everyone.